Okay, so short essay instructor feedback for our client, John. So now I did two things. I put the answer or my feedback in two places. So it's listed here so you can see it on its own, since that's what was asked of you in the quiz. And then I've also put in my entire write up here, and then you can see the diagnosis written out within the context of my entire write up for our client, John. Okay, so, and also just like we did with Taru, I'm going to pull up the visual for the criteria. Okay, so, so the case of John also provides an illustration for us of why going through the details of how the DSM defines delusions, hallucinations, uh, disorganized speech, and grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior, why there's so much text, and why we spend a good amount of lecture time in this section on making sure we understand have a good understanding of how the DSM defines those phenomena. Okay, and actually having their own criteria to them, like a criteria how you like identify them. Meaning, okay, so then because then we can come back here and clearly define. Going back to our write up here, then we can clearly define with some brief examples. Remember, when you're, and this is both for the test as well as just in doing your work beyond the course, make sure you give at least a brief example. It doesn't have, it doesn't have to be lengthy here, but don't just write, delusions, hallucinations, disorganized, grossly disorganized behavior. Make sure you have at least one example of each, and it can be brief, just like it is here. Okay. So we see this, right? So we just basically we are just making sure that we've identified at least three. And in the case of John, I think we can identify examples of all four. And then just briefly what those examples are. Okay. And then of course the key here is that, as again, we're going with what the script and then the actors working from the script, what they're telling us in their story. This is a recent onset. It's definitely not met the 6-month criteria threshold for schizophrenia, which is very important because there may be many times where a client, John, or a client like John might present to an emergency healthcare setting and be given a diagnosis of schizophrenia. That's not accurate. We do not know this is schizophrenia yet. It could be for sure, but we do not know that because of that criteria B. Okay, and then criteria C, not better explained. Now, there could be additional data, like if you were experimenting with hallucinogens, for example, that might explain this, the presentation, right? His symptoms and what he's presenting to us, but not met at this time, or hence the provisional diagnosis. You might add pending additional information, that kind of thing. But just you want to note in C that its criteria is not met. So it is actually poor provisional for that reason, pending more information. Just as an aside, the provisional highlight here, well, I'm highlighting this. The provisional, I wrote that there for our purposes. Depending on what kind of electronic record you're working with, most that I've ever worked with don't have a designation for, an actual full diagnosis or principal diagnosis, DSM calls it, versus provisional. But I just put that provisional here just for our learning purposes. You wouldn't necessarily write that, or if you have a free text option in whatever you're entering your assessment into, to state as provisional is probably a good idea, good practice. Just depends on what kind of technology, what platform you're working with when you're doing data entry into your putting your assessment into whatever system you're using. Okay, so that is our instructor feedback, or going over the diagnosis for our client, John.